Not small men, women's football insiders saying what they really think.
For this interview, I spoke to Moya Dodd and started by asking her about her work at the World Leagues Association. Tell me about that, its work and what it hopes to achieve and what it's found so far.
Well, the World Leagues Association was historically a grouping of men's football professional leagues, particularly those who had broken away from their federations and they were run independently, essentially by the clubs themselves. And there's 40 plus of those. And a few years ago, they started to think about women's football because it was obviously emerging in the landscape. You'd see the Women's World Cups and they would be very successful, and also the clubs who were playing in the top men's leagues were also starting to play in women's leagues. So their clubs were concerned with women's football. So I started doing some work with the World Leagues Association at that point, and it led us to the point where we just really congregated the leading independent and some of them integrated also with men's leagues, women's football leagues around the world who have an eye to professionalism and who are aiming at professionalism. There's also some federation-run leagues in the group because we don't want to exclude some of the very important leagues in a sporting sense that are still run by federations, like Germany, for example. England was one at the time, although it's just become independent. So I find that group has a really fascinating set of issues. Women's professional football, well, we know that it poked its head up 100 years ago and was quickly blattered away, or should I say, that's probably not a verb. It sounds too much like someone's surname, but it was like whack-a-mole, really. It was just pushed back down into its burrow and left there for 50 to 100 years, really. And it took that long before we started to see crowds that were of the size that were there in 1920 and 1921. And professionalism did emerge in small ways back in the post-World War I era, because women during the World War were raising money for the war effort, and that was considered a perfectly acceptable thing to do. Women play football, raise money for soldiers. Fine, big tick. Once the soldiers came home, it was like, wait, what? Women are being paid? They might be like, this is outrageous. We have to stop this. And also there were debates around professionalism per se, because there was a big class structure, of course, going on. But you add gender issues onto that, and it was just all too much. And then the doctors would pile on and say, your ovaries are going to drop out or whatever. And, that was the end of official women's club football in England. And it was the end of England exporting it to so many countries where it exported men's football. So it actually, while that might have happened somewhere in the dark corridors of the FA in 1921, I think, it had reverberations all around the world. And it took, about 100 years for us to get a crowd size, again, that was as big as the one that they had in Liverpool on Boxing Day in 1920. You didn't see a 53,000 crowd, with the possible exception of Copa 71. You didn't see a 53,000 crowd for a long, long time after that. And you think, wow, we've just lost like a century. We've just lost a century of progress and development. Not to mention all of the social implications of that. I mean, had we seen women as heroes in team sports, as heroes in physical pursuits, as heroes in the public domain, then perhaps women would have had an easier time breaking through in business and politics and in other fields. From my time as a child, I don't remember any women's team sport on television or in the public eye, really, at all. There were a few sportswomen who I was aware of, Olympians and whatever, but they'd be in like swimming or tennis or running. They'd be individual sports. Team sports, the economics of a team sport to get to a professional level, those economics are much more challenging, as we know. You can't become a great player all by yourself or kicking a ball against a wall, much as I tried when I was a kid. You don't become a good player until you're playing in a good team. So you need good players around you to learn how to play in a good team, and you need other good teams to play against. So you need to build out the pyramid of football to enable that improvement. And, that's not an overnight task. You can't just have one brilliant athlete who goes off and wins a gold medal or something and then inspires a generation to all take up whatever, pole vaulting or whatever it is they're doing. With team sports, it's a much slower trek, and all of the social attitudes towards women playing football in particular had a big bearing on the rate at which it was able to grow. And I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new. You've heard this story from,
Sure.
I guess, everyone you've spoken to. So I find the emergence of the women's professional leagues now, I think it will be one of the most profound influences for progress and change. We've seen the impact that having recognised women's national team competitions had. Those national teams have taken us so far down the track in gaining recognition and for the development of the sport, and they're clearly important, very important. But, between national team games, people need to play club football. And if they can do so in a professional environment where they get paid a livable wage, where they've got good support from coaches, doctors, dietitians, psychologists, etc. If they can do that in a good professional daily training environment, then the improvement is spectacular. I mean, that's why you've seen, I think, the World Cup grow so brilliantly over the last few editions, is because more and more of those players are coming from full-time professional environments, and they're able to improve and perform at a much higher level.
That raises so many questions. It's absolutely fascinating. So you mentioned about the rise of national teams, and as you say, that the Women's World Cup is, I think, already going to take its place as one of the crown jewels of football. And you look at national teams that perform really well. Let's take, I think, South Africa. I think have performed well, and some other African nations as well. Yet you look at the league structures over there, and you have, within South Africa, you have these like very successful teams within South Africa, and similarly some other countries. But how do you feel about what's currently happening? Is that it seems to be a number of the best African players, they play for the national team, but then they go and they're taken by the NWSL and by the WSL and the other sophisticated European leagues, developed European leagues. It's kind of, what should the balance be? It feels almost a little bit like old-fashioned colonialism to go and like take the assets and then leave what in those kind of developing countries themselves.
Well, I think there's two sides to that coin. And if I look at a country like Australia, where football has not been the major commercial sport, it's the major participation code, but it hasn't been the major code commercially. And then I look at the so-called golden generations of male footballers that we've had. The 2006 team that went to the World Cup in Germany. You had a lot of players in the Premier League then. You had, Tim Cahill, Harry Kewell, Mark Schwarzer, Lucas Neal. The fact that we had players in top leagues playing at a top level every week meant that the national team could perform better. At the same time, I think the reality is, certainly in men's football, that Europe is the landlord of the world. They bring in the best players from all over the world. They produce great product, a great commercial product, spectacular matches, terrific show, and they sell it back to those of us sitting on the other side of the world by way of, watching advertisements or paying subscriptions. That is economics. That's market economics. What's the solution? Well, if you could have, and in women's football, we have got an opportunity to shape the environment in a different way, partly
Absolutely.
because the spread of talent and the spread of high performance around the world is a very different pattern to what you've seen in men's football. I mean, still some of the same challenges arise, but I think obviously Europe is very strong, the leagues are very strong, and there's a lot of great players going there, but it's not as concentrated, I would suggest, as what you've seen in men's football. mean, in men's football, there's only 2 continents who've ever won a World Cup, I think, UEFA and CONMEBOL. In women's football, well, it's interesting actually. The team that has won more World Cups and more Olympic gold medals than any other is actually the United States of America. Why? I think it's because they had Title IX working for
Yeah,
them in the
absolutely.
universities with a very simple rule
Absolutely.
that says you can't discriminate on the basis of sex in the programming that you offer if you take federal government funding. So any college or university that took even $1 of federal government funding had to go through these sort of self-scrutiny and external scrutiny to ensure that they were not discriminating. So that meant a simple rule that basically says you can't discriminate meant that many programs were opened to women in colleges and universities. It helped the professions and so on, but it had its biggest impact probably in sport. And that's why so many products of the US college system are winning gold medals at the Olympics, whether they are American citizens playing in an American team or whether they are citizens from other countries who have gone to the US and benefited from that regime. So, there's been this machine called the US college system operating under the rules of Title IX, which has been pumping out women athletes for decades now. That's been around
Yeah.
for 50 years, Title IX. And I think the 99ers would say they were all daughters of Title IX, and it hasn't let up since, frankly. Even the 91ers, I think, who won the first World Cup for the US team,
Yeah.
were mostly of the generation that benefit from Title IX.
So, do you think, and just follow that question? I mean, you've talked about the benefits of players coming from less developed countries into the more developed footballing countries of Europe and WSL. That builds a national team, and that in itself means that can be a beacon. But how can we make the connection back if you are an African player and you've originated out of South Africa and you've got yourself into the NWSL or a European team? I see how the European team, the NWSL team do well. I see how the player does well. I see how the national team does well. How do we translate that back into the leagues within that country, the clubs benefiting out of this, so everybody benefits?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I know that within country structures, there are debates about the head losing touch with the body, with, the best teams getting more and more resources and lesser teams being unable to compete. And that debate is going on all over the pyramid of football. It's going on, for example, in men's European football, where those who make Champions League and are on the end of those funds that flow in are able to leave others in their wake when they go back to compete in their domestic league because they've had to build a squad that's capable of competing at Champions League, so they go back to their national league and they really are a lot better than the teams in the bottom half of the table. There's always been what I call a vertigo problem in developing leagues, and that is that there's a very big gap between the top team and the bottom team. You could look at the number of points they accumulate during the year or the number of wins and losses or goals conceded, and you're like, oof, ouch, that poor team on the bottom has really had a very tough year. And that goes to the competitive intensity of a league. I think, for example, we saw the French national team improve quite rapidly when Lyon professionalised because there are a lot of players who were suddenly able to be in a more professionalised training environment. But you've still got a limited number of teams in that league who are offering those environments for players in France. And, the competitive intensity of the league suffers if people are playing one tough game every 2 or 3 weeks, or if the games are competitive for the first 20 minutes and then there's at least 2 or 3 goals in the net and the game loses
Yeah.
its zing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's challenging for all developing leagues, and I would say there's some men's football leagues who have to deal with those challenges as well. But then when you add another sort of international layer onto that, it can be even more challenging. For example, the teams in the Men's Club World Cup, if there's a sort of a financial bounty that comes out of participating in those competitions. If you layer up more and more competitions with a financial bounty for the best teams to play in, then actually it doesn't solve that vertigo problem at all.
It makes it worse.
I think, I believe that the national leagues are the link between the pyramid that they sit on top of and the rest of the world. That is where, if those leagues lose members, this is why the European Super League idea caused so many people to object, because they could see that if you took away the best 2 or 3 teams out of, the Spanish league and this league and that league, that the rest of the league would really suffer. And you would create this kind of super league where you have super clubs competing against each other every week. And, that would sooner or later become subject to limited contest for promotion and relegation, because it would just simply become out of reach for everyone else to compete. So I think as we develop women's football, the strength and the solidarity of those national leagues is really crucial. The ability of the lowest ranked team, the bottom team in those leagues, to go out and give it a red hot go against the top team in that league, if that's still a game, then, that's a very good thing, because you'll have competitive intensity. And we all know that, without resistance, you don't improve. It's like lifting weights in the gym. Unless you're lifting weights that are going to put you out of your comfort zone
You need
and
to be challenged.
create resistance, then you're not really going to get any stronger. And it's likewise for players. If they've got a game that lasts for 10 minutes and it's all over because you're already 4-0 up, then they're not going to improve much from a game like that.
Yeah. And it's not going to be much of a spectacle for fans, is it, either?
Well, that's true. And, I think this is where the growth of professionalism is important. Women's football has been, frankly, a side hobby for those who run men's football for a long time, be that at federation level or club level or whatever. Now, my wish, and I think I would say one of the key kind of levers for change is for women's football to have its own mind and its own self-determination. If you can't decide for yourself, if a women's team can't decide for itself what it needs for success, if it can't make decisions in its own best interest, if a women's league can't make decisions in its own best interest, if you're constantly being compromised by other considerations that are being traded off for your best interests, then of course development is going to be in the slow lane. We've all, we've seen that. That's been going on for 100 years.
Absolutely.
We don't need to be told how that works. We've seen it. What is new and different is having women's football entities, whether they're clubs or leagues, or even, divisions within federations, that are given their own mind. And they can wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to do what's good for me today. I'm going to do what makes me grow and makes me healthy. And that's going to be my focus. So if we need to, hire a dedicated coach, then that's what we're going to do. If we need to market the game on the weekend to a different audience, then that's what we're going to do. If we need to schedule the fixtures in a bigger stadium or a smaller stadium, then that's what we're going to do. We're not going to be the sort of tail of the dog that gets wagged by other factors. Typically, the best interests of men's football as it exists in that entity. It's no accident that you've seen such spectacular, such extraordinary valuation growth in the US amongst clubs that are dedicated to women's football. That's not an accident.
Yeah. I feel like, that was fantastic. This is absolute gold and music to my ears. And again, after having 20 conversations, variations on his theme keep coming up. I feel like I don't know if it's an analogy or a metaphor. The metaphor that as I've kind of gone through this, it's occurred to me is that men's football feels like the guy who's sitting on a sofa, manspreading across the entire sofa, and says, "Take a seat," and women's football goes, "Where? Where am I supposed to sit?"
You should be a cartoonist for the Women's Football Weekly, Charlie. I can see you. You can see you. And you
Yeah, I've
could
got
put various people's heads on that figure as well, and it might make perfect sense.
good. So I'm glad to see that's a metaphor that's landed. So let me. Gosh, so many questions I was going to ask you. So let's follow this theme through. So you're talking about, I think, the how different things could be better for women's football if it had independence of clubs. And, Chelsea are interesting talking about now about potentially floating off their club. Independence of leagues, and we're seeing now with NewCo and obviously NWSL. How high up can and should that independence go? Independence of federations, independence of FIFA. I mean, is it time for a SHIFA? Could that ever happen?
People have thought about that a lot. It's not something that the current structure would contemplate or permit. There would have to be very significant changes to the sort of statutory construct of the international governing body for that to occur. And I'm not sure that the predominantly male constituency of FIFA or any national member federation for that matter would vote for it. I mean, the essence of sports governance is that the governing body, and let's start at national level, the governing body has to control all of that sport in the country. And that includes men's and women's sport in the case of football. It includes futsal and a bunch of other things if you go look in FIFA statutes. And we've seen many instances of where, if that national governing body is not able to control all of football in its country, the consequence is that it can be suspended. And FIFA says you're suspended because, look, there's this rebel league or something that's going on. You have to get that rebel league under control or we're going to suspend you. And when you're suspended, that means that sporting contact is prohibited with the other members. So nobody will play against your national team. You won't be playing in the World Cup. And essentially the public pressure then on the rebel activity is so enormous because they are standing in the way of, your national team playing in the World Cup and anyone else having sporting contact with you. So, the weight, the consensus of compliant member federations, all of that globally is brought to bear on this country who's cut off from everybody until they fall into line. And falling into line means putting an end to the rebellion and taking control over all of football in the country again. That's how you would get back into FIFA if you were suspended. Now, I mean, FIFA is not unusual in this regard. I think this is how most international sporting federations work. But it is a very powerful form of centralised control, which makes the power of governing bodies essentially self-reinforcing over time.
I mean, I'm going to say something really naive, which is when you put it like that, that's kind of shocking, to be honest with you. And you've put a new metaphor and image into my head, which is there's a guy with his wife sharing a house, and she's under massive coercive control from the guy, and she says, "I'm leaving. I'm going to do my own thing." And he says, "Well, if you do, you won't see any of our friends. You'll never see the kids again. I'll cut off your bank account. I'll do everything possible to make your life impossible." It feels that what you're saying is that FIFA, and let's be generous and say inadvertently, exhibits a form of coercive control over women's football.
Well, that's an interesting metaphor that you've drawn, Charlie. I think if I was to draw it, I would be regarded as a man-hating something or other. But look, I mean, this is how sports governance works, I think. This is how national bodies are able
Is
to
my
maintain
metaphor fair?
control over, and it's not just over the women's game, it's over anybody who
Yeah, but
wants to break out, right?
yeah,
This is how sports
Yeah.
governance works. And you might ask, well, gosh, isn't that exclusionary conduct? Aren't there competition laws about this
Yeah.
sort of
Aren't
thing?
there?
Well, the question is, who's the international competition regulator? I mean, most competition regulators exist at national level. I mean, you've got the European Commission, of course, but mostly they exist at national level. So they'll look at competition issues in a sport nationally, and they'll say, oh gosh, everyone's agreed a salary cap. Is that okay? That sounds like collusion, but it's okay because it enables a league to exist that wouldn't otherwise exist, or something like that. So things will be considered often at national level. I mean, the international match calendar is another example of conduct by an international governing body, which has within its own statutes and regulations, it has the power to set the international match calendar, and it does. What that means is that it is, and it must do so, by the way, in consultation with the confederations. So it will essentially consult with its own members or aggregations of its own members, and we know that its own members are exclusively national governing bodies. There's not a players' union in there, there's not a league representative in there, there's not a fan representative, etc. It's national governing bodies. So again, it's a pyramid of pyramids who are, by their nature, by their statutory character, they are essentially monopolists. So then the peak monopolist, FIFA, says, well, I'm going to set an international match calendar. Now, on these days, the rules will be that employers, clubs, must release their employees to work for somebody else who is playing in their national team, who will be playing in competitions that enrich me and others who run national team competitions, confederations, for example. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, what it's saying is, on these days of the year, your employees won't be showing up, who you're paying, by the way. On these
Yeah, you're
days of the
paying
year,
them.
your employees won't be showing up to work because they'll need to be released to work for someone else. And if you don't release them, they're not going to be allowed to work for you. They can't play for you that weekend if you have refused to release them to play for their national team. Okay? So it's kind of a work ban on them if they don't go off or they don't make themselves available for their national team. I mean, that's kind of extraordinary. I can't think of any other industry where that occurs. And as you've seen, the leagues have been complaining that they're not properly consulted in the setting of this match calendar. And you've seen how extreme those changes can be. For example,
Very.
shifting a Men's World Cup from one season to another. That's a pretty big change. It means that leagues that normally play through those weeks and months have to stop or just play on without their best players. It even means that whoever runs the hot dog stand outside the stadium that is not holding matches for those 6 weeks or so while the Men's World Cup was on, they're not selling hot dogs, right? So it had all kinds of impacts down the line. You've seen the Men's World Cup be expanded from 32 teams to 48 teams, from 64 matches to 104 matches. I mean, these are very big incursions into the rest of the calendar, into a player's time, a player's energy, potentially their well-being. And, we know already that 2 players' unions are suing FIFA over the Men's Club World
Yeah.
Cup and saying, it's just
Yeah.
too much. People are meant to
Yeah.
have holidays. Employees have
Yeah.
rights to holidays. When are we supposed to have holidays? And, how is it that a governing body that has regulatory power and is supposed to govern the game for the good of all in it is able to make rules that so obviously favour their own commercial assets, such as a competition like the Club World Cup or the World Cup, through the setting of the calendar? Those are good questions. They are big governance questions, and it's interesting to
They are.
see them being debated in the ESL case. And who knows where these latest complaints around men's football and the Men's Club World
You
Cup
see,
will take us.
I mean, all of these things, the more I talk to people, and you talk about a whole other new angle about the the governance, the control aspect of all these authorities and the World Authority, it's hard to imagine almost any single aspect of the way men's football organises itself that women's football would want to copy. I mean, I'm hard pressed to think of almost any single aspect that you'd go, that's really good, let's do the same thing. And yet it feels like the trajectory is hurtling towards that. How do you feel about that?
Well, look, I guess there's some days when you wake up and you think, why do we even like sport? I mean, especially, I have to say, especially when you look at situations of abuse and players whose vulnerabilities are exploited. I mean, there's a lot of examples of this, and they just turn your stomach. So I won't go on about them here, but I have to say, on those days, when you consider those experiences and ongoing experiences and vulnerabilities of especially women in the game, but also others, then you think, why do we even like sport? But the reality is we're all captivated by it. And our passion for the game is, I guess I feel like it's appropriated in some ways, because once the ball starts rolling, people are like, oh, but this is so good. And they forget if it's being badly governed. So they're just completely
Of
absorbed,
course.
completely
Of
captivated
course.
by the game itself. And there are lots of things to love about men's football. I mean, of course, it was the only kind of football I watched for a long time. I mean, I never even saw a national team game until I was sitting on the bench, about to play in one. I mean, I literally never saw a national women's
Funny.
team play before I was playing in one. I might have had one game on the bench before I had to go on, but that was the only time I'd seen international women's football. Um, so most of us fell in love with football because we were watching men's football, at least people of my era, because that was all
Yeah,
there was to see.
sure.
And what do you love about it? I mean, it's magical. The way the ball moves, the patterns of passing and movement, it's so
Oh, yeah.
dynamic. The way the fans are so sometimes so sort of joyful and hilarious, and um, they can make it just such a party. It's a celebration. It's like a party every week when their team plays, and of course it can get ugly. Of course, we've all seen the ugly side of football, but I've got to say, women's football, by and large, I think the fan culture in women's football is wonderful. I mean, it's honestly football without the ugly bits. There's everything to love about it.
So that's a great quote. So, yeah, I mean, I love men's football as well. I love it, but I think I'm not alone in thinking that it's lost. It's gone. We're never getting it. We're never getting. When we go there in the stadium and we can, and small or big, we can suspend our knowledge of everything else around it, and we watch it and we love it. The thing that happens on the pitch,
Yes.
but everything else, we do have to suspend it. So, okay, let me do a thought experiment, which is it's a it's a little bit kind of as long as the answer will be. So the thought experiment is this. The thought experiment is two. Okay, one is that men's football doesn't exist. It never existed. There's just this thing called women's football. Okay?
Mhm.
What would it feel like? What would it be like? How would women's football be if men's football simply did not exist? There was just women's football.
I'm working hard to imagine that.
It's a big one. We're so conditioned.
Well, and I think all of professional sport began as men's professional sport. I'm trying to think of any professional sport that started with women only. I don't think there is one.
Well, netball, I suppose. There are a few.
Ball, but is it truly professional? I mean, it's kind of
There's
struggling a bit, isn't it?
Yeah, there's professional leagues. It's modest, but
There are,
you're
but
anyway.
yeah,
I think your point is clearly correct, isn't it? Things started, but it's like, but football being the world's religion, being the biggest sport just by a country mile, being a religion, it's, I don't know, maybe it's an impossible thought experiment because we can't imagine a world without men's football, and yet it feels like from so much of what you say that in order to imagine women's football being authentic to women, what women want, what the players want, what female fans want, we have to try and disregard, to deprogram, to understand what it is that we need out of women's football.
I think it is hard to deprogram ourselves because we only understand the game of football because we saw men playing it. I only understand it because I saw men playing it. And what I have seen as women's football has become a spectacle that's much more watched now, I have seen that women are changing. Women's football and women's sport more broadly is changing the way that sport is consumed. So I think when you buy a ticket to watch men's football, not everybody, but some people are buying, the right to be angry, the right to be shouty and noisy and say things that you can't say anywhere else. You're buying a license to behave in a way that is unique to that venue. I mean, things go on in stadiums that you wouldn't do in the street. Get your tits out for the lads. I mean, no one shouts that or chants that in a doctor's office, and yet they'll chant it at Evercanero in, you know, Stamford Bridge. The
Absolutely.
people have paid a lot of money for a ticket who have means. I mean, they're wealthy, well-educated people, I guess, and yet they'll chant this nonsense. So they're buying a release, I suppose. They're kind of buying. They think they're buying a leave pass from civility. Some people, not all, of course. Some people are just wanting to see a great game of football. They're buying it for the spectacle itself, or for their long-term love of a club brand that they've always followed. But it develops around that it comes with this leave pass to behave appallingly. And I think that when you buy a ticket to women's sport, nobody really thinks they're buying this leave pass. They're buying a ticket to a sporting event and a great sporting spectacle, of course, because we now have athletes who are in good daily training environments, putting on a phenomenal show of athleticism and skill. So that's great. I think that's common to both men's and women's football. You're buying a sporting spectacle. I think, and actually Angel City say this. They say when they, selling something to people, they're selling the sporting spectacle. They're also selling social purpose. And I would say that women's football, when you buy a ticket to women's football, you're buying into what it stands for as well as what it is on the field. And what does it stand for? I think, to me, it stands for gender equality, it stands for women's empowerment, and it stands for broad-based inclusion by anyone who wants to come and watch. It's a safe space. You're buying a place in a safe space if you buy a ticket to women's football. And the third aspect, which I think is interesting and developing quite quickly, is popular culture. I mean, this is driven by, I think, the players who have historically been very much underwhelmingly paid by their federations and by their clubs. Players have gone off and taken advantage of social media. They've built big profiles. They'll be selling you, branded clothes or whatever. So, pop culture comes into it in a big way as well, I think, in women's sport. Not to say it doesn't in men's sport, but I think women footballers have been particularly good at cultivating their online brands.
Yeah.
I mean, when Alex Morgan played for Spurs for a little while, I remember looking at the numbers, and she had millions of followers, and the club itself. I mean, she vastly outweighed the number of followers that the club itself had and the league itself had.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty extraordinary.
And as that happens, Alicia Lima went to Juventus from the WSL. She's got so many more followers than Juventus have. So it's. I think you're right. I think we are just tapping into and understanding the difference and power of women's football. That is, it's different, completely different.
And there are young men who say, I'm not that interested in going to watch the men's sport because it's all a bit, ugly, and there's too much beer getting thrown around, and it's not an environment I can really relax in. I'd much rather go to the women's football. I can have a good time. I see a good game of sport, but it's just a much nicer place to be. And I wouldn't argue with them.
They're quite right. Now I'm going to ask you two more questions, but one is just to just go, because I've been doing like a bit of a trip around the world, so I do need to ask you, because for myself included, but also listeners of the hopefully the program, just to talk a little bit about football in Australia and New Zealand. I've So as I've gone and talked to people, and some of the stuff isn't particularly revelatory, but clearly at the one end of the spectrum, the scale of development, we have NWSL, and let's say, I think the Women's Super League is probably a close second, but we have two leagues which are very sophisticated and developed and not overly dominated. At the other end, talk to people about leagues in India, in South Africa, in Kenya, etc. Where does women's football in Australia sit, do you think, at the moment and New Zealand, if I can say, in terms of its development?
Well, we're very proud to have made the semi-finals in the last World Cup and in the Tokyo Olympics. So they were our best ever finishers to get into the top four. Commercially, I have to give credit to our federation, who have realised what an incredible asset the Matildas are. Their last, I think, 14 matches on Australian soil have all been sold out. The last one I was at was 77,000 people in the Olympic Stadium in Sydney for a friendly against China. And, these are phenomenal numbers. It's the hottest ticket in town. It sells out in a few hours. It's like the Lionesses have been having an extraordinary impact. So the national team, I think, and it's I think the most popular national team brand in the country. It's just like stratospheric. And during the World Cup, in that semi-final against England, when Sam Kerr scored that phenomenal goal, and we won't talk about the other goals in the game.
Did they happen?
Well, I don't recall. I've wiped them from my memory. But that game was the biggest television program ever in the history of Australian ratings since the rating system was introduced. So there were 11 million people watching. There's 26 million people in Australia. There were 11 million watching, and there were more in watch parties and stadiums around the country who were looking at it. Some people say it was as high as 17 million. So, this is an enormous number of people singularly watching a game of football and watching women's football. And I think that, that is transcendent. That's a transcendent figure. That's like Super Bowl-ish. It's and where did it come from? It came from women's football. It came from the Matildas. So I think that really set a high watermark. And then you say, well, what about the league? Well, the league grew very solidly over we played during the summer, your winter. So it grew very solidly as well. It was assisted by some of the Matildas from the World Cup playing in Australia. So that was good. Of course, there's always the dynamic where they'll get offered more money elsewhere and may leave. But in fact, every Matilda in the World Cup squad came through the local A-League Women's, the dub as we call it. So, it's a league where you will see probably every future Matilda pass through. And, I think that with the geographic spread of women's leagues around the world and the spread of strength in those leagues, I would hope that Australia could certainly be a leader, a destination league in the region, in the time zone, while accepting that, there's always going to be leading leagues in other parts of the world with greater access to capital or audience or whatever, who are going to have certain advantages over us. At the same time, we've had some pretty good players come play in Australia, in the Australian League over the years. Obviously, that gets more challenging as other leagues become more professional. At the same time, the emergence of professional leagues around the world, I don't see that particularly as a threat, because as we saw with men's football, our best players would go play there and they would come back and they would be better. So they'd be playing for our national team and they'd be better than they would have if they stayed at home. And then often they would repatriate themselves after a while and come back and play in the league here once they, got sick of living in cold, wet places and wanted to see some sunshine.
You're always going to win on that one, I'm telling you. You're always going to
That
win
was a
on that
pretty
one.
quick forfeit, Charlie.
Eh?
That
No,
was a pretty quick
that's
forfeit.
there we go. That's a good one. Brilliant. Listen, it's just because I'm trying to put across to people who many will have a lot of knowledge, but many won't have any knowledge at all of women's football to listen to this. And part of my key audience, by the way, is like guys who can either become allies, supportive, or frankly get out of the way. So thinking about the state of women's football, is there anything I haven't asked, or how you feel in general? And please summarise in one sentence: women's football in the world. Where do you? Okay, let's phrase this. Do you still feel optimistic about women's football as it is, but also women's football where it's heading?
I'm always optimistic, I guess, because I see where the game has come from, and you just can't kill it off. I mean, honestly, if you thought, I've got a great idea, I'm going to try and kill women's football forever. What I'm going to do is I'm going to refuse access to fields in, the main sort of cauldron of development in, the northeast of England in that post-World War One period. I'm going to ban it, ban women from using the fields and the facilities. I'm going to make it culturally a taboo for women to play a man's sport. I'm going to have crowds that shout outrageous things and are misogynist and homophobic and sexist and racist and whatever. I'm going to get all that done, make it a really obnoxious place for women to hang around so that they can't easily watch it. I'm going to arrange for girls or women who choose to play it to be treated with a kind of homophobic disdain by the rest of the world. I'm going to make sure that sponsors, if they ever were to cross their mind that they should sponsor women's sport, that they are also given the opportunity to realise that, these are just a bunch of not actual proper women. They're not playing a proper women's game. They're not behaving like proper women, and that it's really not a great thing for their brand to be associated with that. I'm going to make sure that the media don't cover it or give it any good airtime. I'm going to make sure that the international governing body, when it's finally forced to run tournaments for women, doesn't treat it as a commercial asset or give it any status or regard as a valuable set of rights. I'm going to arrange for those rights to be bundled in for free with men's football until 2023, which is the first time that I'll be making those rights available on an unbundled basis. So that will therefore not only set the perceived value of women's football at zero, but it will actually inflate the perceived value of men's football, because you're getting, a burger with fries, and that's inflating the price of the burger because you're getting these so-called free fries with it. And, amid all of that, I will then ensure that misogyny can reign, even at the level of coercion and abuse amongst players who've got no access to remedy when they are subjected to abuse in their footballing lives. All of that actually happened, and yet here we are. We have, I think, the most popular team sport in the world for women now. The numbers, I think they have a lot of trouble counting because there's been so-called 30 million players for at least a decade on the FIFA official count, and it is very difficult to count them.
Yeah.
But you can feel it. This is the most popular team sport in the world. I can certainly feel it here in Australia. It's more popular. It's the most popular game actually for girls under the age of 12 in Australia. So it's bigger than netball, hockey, whatever other women's sport you can think of. Football's the biggest. And
Right.
that is an enormous dial shift from when I was that age, when you were considered like a circus freak if you were a girl who wanted to kick a ball around, especially a round ball. That was not the right shaped ball in the, the city that I grew up. So, all of that happened, and yet here we are. So I'm an optimist that we will always survive as a game, that we will be able to thrive despite neglect and disregard, because we've done it, and we'll always do it. What I hope for, and some days I doubt and some days I believe, but what I hope for is that women's sport can truly fulfill its potential. And for that, it needs to be able to have its own mind to some degree, to act in its own best interest, to consider itself not as the, compromised, second-rate, disregarded second fiddle, I suppose, but actually be able to step into the limelight as its own entity, as have its own success, have its own regard, have its own welcome from the world. And that can happen while it's connected with men's football. I don't think that a complete separation is a necessary condition for women's football to thrive. Not that it would necessarily be practical anyway, but I think that you do see some clubs where women's football is taken really seriously, where people have tried, they have recognised that it was treated as a poor relation, and they have done everything they could to correct that. Lewis is an outstanding example of a club that just, one day said, you know what, that's wrong. And those questions that you get asked by your daughter as she grows up from a little girl into a young adult, it's like, why are there no girls when she's watching the Tour de France? Or why is this? Why is that? And, it's hard to answer those questions because there is no answer. It's just that's how it is. And then sooner or later, somebody comes along and says, well, I don't accept that answer. I'm going to do what I can to change it.
Absolutely.
And I'll do what I can within my circle of influence, whatever that may be. I had a crack at changing some things in FIFA. You've had a crack at changing things in Lewis. I mean, this is how change happens. It doesn't necessarily happen quickly, but it happens because people go, why are we doing it that way?
Yeah.
And you can look at history. Sometimes things happen that way for hundreds of years, and then all of a sudden they don't. Look at slavery. It happened that way for hundreds of years. And then maybe not all of a sudden, but, eventually people are like, well, no, that's not okay. And also we're going to not do it. So the world does change, and it's people who change it. It's people and movements and new ideas and people who can imagine a different future. So the future I would imagine for women's football, I would want to see it given its own mind, able to govern itself more independently or make decisions in its own best interests by whoever is governing it, to be a safe place that is fully inclusive, where people, regardless of their background or any element of disadvantage that they may suffer, can be there and be safe and excel within it. And a place where people understand that actually the journey is what matters the most. I was always told as a player, focus on the process and not the outcome. And, it might be the 40th minute and you've just given away a penalty, and you can go in at halftime feeling terrible about it all. But the only way to deal with all of that is to focus on what you're going to do in the second half. So what is my job now? What is my job now? What is my job now? That was a question we were constantly taught to ask ourselves. And, you could dream about lifting a trophy or whatever, but dreaming about lifting a trophy is just a distraction when your job is to mark someone or find some space or get that cross in. So I think that, I think that's actually part of the culture of the women's game, that we take the process for what it is and enjoy it for what it is. And then the outcome will look after itself. The outcome will be the best outcome that you are capable of getting, given all the circumstances you're dealing with. And if you win, you win. If you don't, well, you learn, and then you have a go next week. And I think taking the the judgment, the anger, the hostility out of a loss, out of a result, if you can subtract that, then it really lets the game shine for what it is, because there's always going to be losers. There's always
Yeah,
going to be
sure,
losers in a
sport.
game of football. And if, everyone in the game has to learn to deal with that. If you can learn to deal with that and take out the ugly bits because you've actually felt merit in the process, of course the disappointment, but you've still felt the merit of the journey, then, that to me would really start to give us the football we deserve. Did that make sense?
Moya, that makes so much sense that I want to broadcast it across the FIFA corridors, across all the different federations and all the clubs, to go, please just have a listen and stop and think. None of us, and you've been in the game, for such a long time as a player, as administrator, seen so much of it. It's hard for someone to say, and the answer is. But I do feel that in talking to you and so many people so far, that it's crystallizing pretty fast about pretty much where the kind of answer lies, because we know the kind of game that women's football can be if it were just unleashed, if it were just given its head, essentially. And how to do that? I think there are ways, and I'm hoping that to some extent, this series can just play its part in provocatively asking those questions and suggesting maybe things aren't right now, and maybe there is another way to do it. Moya, thank you so much. That's been what a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for running over 15 minutes. It was brilliant.